This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi called Columbus, and sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is part of a larger expose called Sin City South. The episode's title is The Dixie Mafia's Playground. Welcome to Sin City South, an expose that uncovers the secrets of a small town. Today, we're diving into the fascinating and sometimes dark history of Columbus, Mississippi during Prohibition and beyond. We'll explore how this seemingly quiet southern town earned the name Sin City South and became a hotbed for bootlegging, gambling, and other illicit activities. From speakeasies hidden behind barbershops to high stakes poker games in smoky back rooms. Back in the day, Columbus had it all. But let's set the scene. Picture this as the 1920s and Prohibition has just begun. The 18th Amendment has made the production, transport, and sale of alcohol illegal across the United States. But in Columbus, Mississippi, the liquor keeps flowing. How? Well, let's set the scene. Bootleggers brought in Canadian whiskey and beer by river, rail, and road. The Tombigbee River, which runs through Columbus, became a major smuggling route. Bootleggers would often disguise their boats to avoid suspicion. One clever bootlegger, known as Catfish Charlie, even hollowed out his daily catch to hide particular bottles of moonshine from the moonshiners. Bootleggers hid their larger stashes in the prairie, in the woods, and even on unsuspecting neighbors' land. One famous hiding spot was actually a Civil War era cannon on the grounds of Mississippi University for Women. The bootleggers would stuff bottles inside, at the time, the open barrel, knowing that no one would think to look there. Another popular hiding spot was the hollow of an ancient oak tree in Friendship Cemetery, where bottles were lowered by rope and retrieved as needed. Wow. Clubs and lounges popped up across the river and north of town. These establishments often masqueraded as legitimate businesses during the day. A barbershop might transform into a speakeasy at night, with patrons entering through a secret back door. For example, one barbershop on Main Street was known for its excellent haircuts by day, but after hours, a hidden panel in the back wall slid open to reveal a bustling speakeasy. Now, the key ingredients for such a life? A thirsty audience with cash and a legal system willing to look the other way. Local law enforcement was often paid off or simply chose to ignore the illegal activities, focusing instead on more, quote, serious crimes. It was rumored that more than one sheriff in that era received a monthly envelope of cash from each speakeasy owner in downtown Columbus in exchange for his blindness. Of course, the sheriffs and the constables of the time were also part of this same uh, financial windfall, shall we call it. Prohibition in Mississippi and Lowndes County especially lasted well into the modern era. It wasn't until 1966 that Mississippi repealed prohibition laws, and even then left it to the individual county to determine how and if they would repeal their dryness. There are still 36 counties in Mississippi that prohibit beer and light wine sales. But now let's meet some of the more colorful characters of the 1950s to the 1990s, who became the second wave of players in Columbus's underworld, uh, who became part of what is now today known as the Dixie Mafia. And to learn more about how that occurred and who some of those characters were and why, you'll want to listen to a previous episode called Sin City South, the Dark Underbelly of Columbus. So one of those colorful characters, or a list of them, were Sam Langford, Buddy Adair, a guy named Strickland and Honeycutt, and Alfred Wright. They were a group of professional safecrackers who turned bootleggers and bar owners. These men were known for their ingenuity in hiding their illicit goods in plain sight. There was the 300 400 cab company, a front for alcohol delivery, often never actually picking up passengers. This clever operation used the guise of a taxi service to deliver booze all over town. One of its most famous recipients was one of the local judges. If stopped by police, drivers would claim they were simply going to take a fare to their destination or were picking one up. The company slogan, "Will get you where you need to go," took on a whole new meaning for those in the know. The cab company in town will play an even darker part in Columbus's history in a future episode about several of the murders in town. Alfred Wright was the grandfatherly kingpin who ruled Columbus's criminal underworld until 1990. Wright was known for his charm and generosity, often helping out locals in need. He was known to pay off mortgages for struggling families and even anonymously fund college educations for promising students from poor backgrounds. And yet, he also was known for running a ruthless knee cracking business as well. This Robin Hood like persona made him a beloved figure despite his highly illegal activities. Columbus was home to a variety of clubs in this era, bars, lounges. They all were populating across the town, north, south, east, and west, and they served as fronts for illegal activities usually. So let's take a tour of some of the most notorious ones. There was the Southern Air, which was popular with college kids, especially from nearby Mississippi State, which resides in a dry county. This club was known for its live music and its dance floor, and on business nights, you might find future politicians and business leaders rubbing elbows with known criminals. Prior to the Southern Air, there was an establishment called the Governor's Lounge. Now, both the Southern Air and the Governor's Lounge were owned by Alfred Wright. They owned the businesses. Originally, the Governor's Lounge was the site of a wealthy family's summer lodge. This upscale establishment catered to Columbus's elite, offering high-stakes poker games and top-shelf liquor for some. It's said that more city business was conducted there in the Governor's Lounge than at City Hall. The lounge's alleged signature drink was the Governor's Pardon, a potent mix of imported gin, local honey, and a secret ingredient rumored to be absinthe. Wow, that sounds pretty knockout. Another club, also owned by Alfred Wright, was called Go-Go Beach. Now, this was a segregated club where black patrons could dance, gamble, and swim. And despite the racial tensions of the time, Go-Go Beach became a cultural hub for the African American community in Columbus. It was here that blues legends like Howlin' Wolf are said to have played, developing their raw, powerful sound that would influence generations of future musicians. Then there was the Silver Spur. That was originally built in World War II on land owned by George Dyson. The land was leased by Alfred Wright back when building materials were rationed because, of course, it was World War II. Wright built the building, and it was essentially a barn. And at some point, a man, Joe Burns, would buy the bar, and at that point, it would burn down. Now, a lot of these bars have a bad habit of burning down, uh, most logically for insurance money. O.G. Coleman ran the Silver Spur from 1978 to 1979, and he, at some point, will be the manager of another seedy dive bar in town, the Del Camino. Another bar in town was the Sharecropper. Now, that was out on Highway 82 in the old Johnny and Helen's restaurant near Dylan Norris Restaurant Supply. It was owned by a man named James Earl Hankins, who was from Pickensville, Alabama. It's my understanding he actually lived in Alabama and had his club in Mississippi. Then, of course, there were the bars on the south side of Columbus, just outside the city limits. The Pad, also called the S Curve, was across from what would become, or what was and is, the APAC gravel pits, but it was near Seminole Garment Plant. Now, that was a very blue-collar dive bar, and it was at this dive bar in 1967 that Joe Kincaid stabbed another man in the heart. In the 1970s and 80s, the Pad was where W girls frequented, and it is said that the prostitution ring that was run on the W campus by members of law enforcement in exchange for tuition breaks and the girls to have some quote spending money, that a lot of the ladies would meet their Johns at the pad. Watch for that in a future episode. I have quite a bit to say on that one. Then there was a place called Arvy's or Eva's place on a section of land called Skid Row, which was behind the garment plants on Pickensville Road. A gentleman named Gene Strickland shot Ernest Mason in a fight there. So it was a bit of a hotbed of a mess, too. In town, right down the road from the courthouse, was the Executive Lounge, right across the street from the respectable Holiday Inn. At the Executive Lounge, lawyers would stop in for a drink, and this was considered a very brazen location, as the level of corruption in the local legal system was happening right at the base of the hill, right behind the courthouse. Sometimes it is said verdicts were reached before the trials even began, right there at a table or at the bar in the Executive Lounge. This this bar was owned by the Adair family. The Adairs were longtime associates of Alfred Wright in the early years. Del Camino was another bar that was mentioned before. It was a dive bar. It eventually becomes the Concord Square and then the South Fork. Now, this was burned down by George Durden for insurance fraud. He goes to jail later for theft, which will be covered in a future episode, and he's quite the character and not the sharpest knife in the knife rack. Anyways, he I think he owned another club called the Golden Bell, although the ownership string on that is not very clear. He was buddies with the guy who ran the Straight Eight, whose name was J.W. Haynes. Then there was the wharf right downtown, and it was next to Pennington's Big Star. It burned down in the early 70s along with the Big Star, and it almost burned down Franklin's office supply store, the WPA built post office, the department store Ruth's, and the Dispatch, which is the local newspaper. The Welding Works was another bar owned by a guy named Johnny Redden. Now, I talked about Johnny Redden in an earlier episode. Redden owned quite a few clubs, including the High Cotton, Plug Nickel, Down at Joe's, Gateway, Bottom Dollar, Elmo's, Change of Pace, and the Red Rose. He was quite the publican, shall we say. Cricket's, yet another bar, was run and I think owned by Ken Montgomery and possibly Ted Hudson. It burned and was investigated for potential arson at one point and potentially insurance fraud. The space then became Mac's Supper Club, owned by Mac Banks, who now has found Jesus and is a singer on YouTube for gospel. The space is now an antique mall. It is no longer a bar. Now, if I have any of these bars' names or ownerships or the chronology of them incorrect, please, I am open for correction. I am doing the best I can because they are such convoluted messes, and who owned them and who managed them. And some were owner managers, and some are managers who work for owners, and some had silent owners. And it's very convoluted and difficult purposefully to unpack. But let's get to the dark side of all these bars. Columbus and the bars were not all fun and games. These establishments often had a darker side. Some clubs housed prostitutes in nearby trailers or shacks. Now, I know that there are more proper names for this today, but I'm going to go with the language of the time. These makeshift brothels were often overlooked by local law enforcement, highlighting the deep-rooted corruption in the city. One such establishment, locally known as the Dollhouse, operated for over 2 decades without a single raid or arrest, and yet the women were often roughed up, mistreated, and did not receive the protections and the help they deserve. Violence was not uncommon. There were multiple shootings and stabbings at various locations. There were gruesome incidents at bars that involved disputes over high stakes poker games or women or both. Arson was suspected in some cases, usually for insurance fraud. George Durden's businesses all burned down the same day, not long after he took out a substantial insurance policy. Investigators noted that the fire started in multiple locations simultaneously. Well, it was more than the investigators. The whole town saw it happen. But no charges were ever truly filed, though Durden goes to jail later for a completely different reason. Drug trafficking became increasingly prevalent in the later years of these bars, with some clubs serving as distribution hubs for large amounts of cocaine and other narcotics. The influx of drugs cast a long shadow over the community that persists to this day. The impact of Columbus's Sin City South era extends far beyond its borders. Some argue that the influx of illegal money actually helped Columbus weather the Great Depression in the early days, better than many of the other southern towns. Local businesses, from car dealerships to clothing stores, benefited from the steady flow of cash, even as other parts of the state struggled. The era left an indelible mark on local culture, with many older residents still speaking fondly of the good old days when the town was wide open. The legacy of corruption has made it harder for it to shake. So, as we wrap up our journey through Columbus's seedy past, we're left with some intriguing questions that I hope to address in future episodes. Why did this activity continue for so long in absolutely plain sight? Was it simply a case of systemic corruption, or did the illegal businesses provide some perceived benefit to the community? Some argued that the illicit economy provided opportunities for social mobility that were otherwise lacking in the working class segregated South. Was there a symbiotic relationship between the criminals and the town elite? I would argue most definitely. Many successful businessmen and politicians of the era got their start in these illicit establishments. Was something even more sinister at play? Some suggest that federal authorities allowed the activity to continue as part of larger investigations into organized crime. Buford Pusser, the man himself from McNairy County, Tennessee, was a close friend of Alfred Wright. Was an entity following that connection and using Columbus to track the movements of larger criminal organizations beyond the Mississippi border. While most of these clubs are now gone, their legacy lives on in the stories and memories of Columbus residents. The era of Sin City South serves as a reminder of how even the most unassuming places can harbor deep, dark secrets. It also raises important questions about the nature of community, law enforcement, and the sometimes blurry line between right and wrong. Join me next time as I continue to explore the hidden histories of Columbus and Lowndes County, where the truth is often stranger than fiction. Until then, remember to look beyond the surface. You never know what secrets might be hiding in your own backyard. And as a side note, if you know anything more about the details of this podcast and about Sin City South and the underworld of Columbus's criminal element of that era, from the 1950s to the 1990s and beyond, I hope that you will reach out to me. I will keep all contact anonymous unless you indicate otherwise. Until next time, this is the Tom Bigby Tales.